There's the personal level. That's as a home gardener, me, collecting seeds, planting them in my garden next year, sharing them with friends and neighbors, family. And so when we do that, we may be trying to save seeds from the largest fruits or the earliest fruits. Maybe we're trying to save money. And we're going to be talking about two key aspects of seed saving, which is the population, the number of individual plants that we need to save seeds successfully, and isolation recommendations. So how far apart do different cultivars need to be so that we avoid contamination from cross-pollination? Okay, so there's a personal level of seed saving where we're going to be a little less concerned about isolation and population. And we'll get into the details on this shortly. Public sharing. So if we are, engaged with seed swaps and seed libraries, or we have a really cool Master Gardener project where we're growing out, the fish pepper or another, heirloom vegetable so that we can share it with the public. This is public sharing, and we're going to be more our seed saving is going to be held to a higher standard. We're going to follow those population and isolation recommendations more closely. And finally, for cultivar maintenance, and this is really what seed companies do and what very serious seed savers do. If they're trying to maintain all the traits of a particular cultivar, they need to save seeds from a large number of plants and a large number of fruits. And they need to be extremely vigilant about protecting the plants from contamination, from outcrossing with other cultivars within their species. So I'm going to, again, I want people to understand this is something that everybody can do, but it's really important as master gardeners that we do understand some of the genetics and the concepts behind these population and isolation recommendations. So we will talk about them in more detail. Okay. So there are basically 5 elements of seed saving, and I don't know if anybody recognizes this plant. This is lettuce about to flower, and you can actually see the little fruits, the ovaries of the lettuce plant below these unopened flowers. And this is a very self-pollinating plant, so it's actually a good one for people to save seeds from. So crop selection, we're going to talk about population size, isolation. These are the 3 more important things to talk about. And number 2 and 3 are especially important because we can't really see the results of any errors that we make until we start planting seeds from that saved crop. In other words, if we didn't pay attention to cross-pollination risks, and we do get a lot of cross-pollination, we won't know it until we plant out the seeds next year. And with population size, the big risk there is inbreeding depression, which simply means that if we keep crossing the same individuals that have the same DNA generation after generation, with certain crops, we can end up getting reduced vitality of that crop. And we'll talk about where that occurs. So anyway, these things happen and we don't see it until we plant our crop. Crop selection, we can make good decisions up front about which crops are going to be easiest to save seeds from, and we'll know what we need to do to be successful. The selection process, deciding what fruits to take off of which plants. You know, that's all involves our eyes and all our senses. Roguing out plants, that simply means removing off-type plants. And storage of seed, you know, we have some control over that, and we can see when seeds are decaying in storage. We can test them. But the things that could cause, you know, the contamination of the seed through cross-pollination, we really need to keep an eye on and understand what's going on. Okay, so let's talk about crop selection. It's very important that we're only saving seed from open pollinated crops. I think most people understand that. It's not that you can't save seed from hybrids, but they will not come true. Really important to learn about the crop that we're growing, how to grow it, what are the what's the flower type within the family or the genus that we're trying to save seeds from. Is it an annual? How is it pollinated? Is it insects? Is it wind? And then those isolation and population requirements, and we'll talk about that. So basically, it is easiest to save seed from annual plants that are mostly self-pollinating. And these would include, I would say some of the easiest would be bean, pea, tomato, and lettuce. So for starting out, that's what I would recommend. They are very uniform, and if you don't save seed from a lot of different individuals, you're still going to get good seed that will come true the following year. It's much harder to save seed when we're talking about biennials. In our climate, that would mean for crops like, you know, beets and the brassicas, we would be lifting plants out of the ground over the winter and storing them and then replanting them in the spring, in most cases, to be able to get flowering and seed production in the second year. Crops that are spinach and beets are also wind pollinated. And so there's a lot of variability, genetic variability in wind pollinated crops. And so it means we have to have many more individuals to grow. Our population of plants from which we'll collect seeds has to be much larger in order for us to be successful. So, and with corn, you need lots of individuals in order to save seed successfully. So that probably is best left to the companies. You know, if you really get into it, I'm sure some of you may have tried this, and that's great, and it can be done. But for most gardeners, those very self-pollinating crops are going to be the ones to stick with. So let's talk again, you know, even in a little more depth about these two concepts: isolation distance, population size. So isolation distance is simply the distance between two different cultivars. If I'm trying to save seed from one particular cultivar, I want to make sure it's X number of feet from the possibility of being cross-pollinated with a different cultivar of the same species. So this, and we'll talk about these distances a little bit. They are not, they're not carved in stone, and you'll see quite a bit of difference between different resources. And even within the Seed Saver Exchange, there are slight differences in the recommended isolation distances between plants. So what would affect isolation difference? Well, if I'm supposed to have my crops, my cultivars 160 feet apart, and I'm only growing one cultivar in my garden, I need to think about what my neighbors are doing if they're within 160 feet of my garden, right? But then what if there's a wall between my neighbor and myself? Now, with the isolation distance here really is referring to insect pollination. When it comes to wind pollination, we're going to need big distances. But for those crops that are insect pollinated, what we're really talking about is how far can a bee fly, or how many bees are in the area, and what's the likelihood that they're going to go from my neighbor's garden to my garden. And that's really affected by lots of things, including topography, structures between my garden and other gardens, the amount of forage, bee forage in the area. So if all bees have to look forward to is what's in my garden and my neighbor's garden, there's a lot more likelihood of cross-pollination. So there are a lot of factors that go into determining how close is too close. Okay, so population size is simply the number of individual plants from which seeds will be saved. And that's, again, to achieve the particular goal. What we're trying to do is prevent inbreeding depression. We want our plants to be strong each year and to carry all the genetic information necessary for that particular cultivar that we're interested in. So let me give you a real specific example, and this comes directly from the Seed Garden, the book, and this is also that 2-page PDF that's in the chat. You'll find this information there. So looking at the 3 different levels and taking tomato as the example, let's say we want to save seed from a favorite open pollinated tomato plant. We really only need one plant to get viable seed. It's a self-pollinating, self-fertile crop. One plant, in fact, one fruit on one plant would provide us with viable seed. Now, that's not recommended. It would be much better to have multiple plants, because then we have more genetic information that's going to be passed through the seeds. But indeed, one plant is all we need. The isolation distance. So let's say we have this favorite cultivar we want to save seed from, and we have 4 other cultivars. It doesn't matter if they're hybrids or open pollinated. If those other plants are cheek to jowl with the one cultivar we want to save seed from, there's a slightly increased chance of cross pollination by bees, essentially. And that's why the recommendation is for a 10-foot distance between cultivars. But if we have this particular group of cultivars we're growing, they're potato leaf cultivars. Some of them, and I'll show you some photos of this a little later on, actually are more likely to be cross-pollinated by bees than other varieties. So potato leaf cultivars have foliage like a potato. The leaves aren't as indented as most tomato cultivars. So in that case, we'd want a 50-foot distance. Now, before we move on to these others, let me just say, if you have, my recommendation in this situation would be, don't just grow one plant of that cultivar that you want to save seed from. Grow as many as you can. And, 5 would be great. If it can only be 3, that's okay. If it's 1, then you are, at more risk of that inbreeding depression that I mentioned. So moving on to the public sharing. Now, here's where we need to be more careful, because we are basically, I wouldn't say certifying, but if we go to a seed swap and we're master gardeners and we're saying we have, saved the seed from this great, local heirloom, and we want you to try it out. And if we haven't done our due diligence, and if we've only grown one plant and only saved seed from a few fruits, we're not really giving people what they deserve, which is a cultivar where more of the genetic information has been saved. And so the recommendation in this case for tomato is 5 to 10 plants for variety maintenance. And just thinking out loud here. If we did have a Master Gardener project and we were saving seed, maybe one Master Gardener, grows 10 plants of this one cultivar that we want to save seed from, and no other cultivars, or, spaces the cultivars properly. But the decision's made, yes, we're going to have 5 to 10 plants, and that's what we're going to save seed from. And that gives us some assurance that we really are maintaining that variety. Now, for seed companies, they must, of course, grow many more plants in the population. In this case, 20 is actually probably enough. For other crops, it would be many more. And notice the isolation distances don't change, because the risk for cross-pollination doesn't really change. Although that's not entirely true, because if we have hundreds of tomato plants in a field, the risk of cross-pollination is going to be much greater along the edge, right? Right in the middle of that field, it's going to be very, very little chance, I think, of cross-pollination. So anyway, I hope that helps explain these 3 levels and their relevance for isolation and population number. Okay, so some of the strategies we can use to prevent this unwanted cross-pollination. Plant just one cultivar of a species. That can help a lot. Now, of course, you still need to know what the neighbors are up to, right? What they're growing. Is it the same species, different cultivars? And then are we so close that there still may be risk of cross-pollination? We can separate cultivars by time. If we grow spring lettuce, we can save seed from that crop and then have a fall crop or a late summer crop, perhaps, that we could save seed from. We can also cover plants. Insect pollinated plants can be covered with screening material to prevent bees from moving pollen onto those plant flowers. And we can also bag flowers and hand pollinate them. And some people do that, especially with squash and pumpkin. So these are all, some strategies that we can employ to reduce that risk. So moving on, plant and fruit selection. I mentioned roguing out off-type plants and not saving seed from plants that, look like they're in distress. Saving seed from the best fruits, and knowing that seeds actually will ripen pretty much at the same time within a fruit. But of course, between fruits, there will be a difference. So when you're seed saving, just to be aware of that. And then some seed saving techniques, and we'll talk more about these in the second part of the talk today. I mentioned that seeds are not always mature when we would typically eat that crop. And squash and pumpkin are good examples, cucumber, eggplant. Other crops, we can save seed at the time we would typically eat the crop. And well, actually winter squash would be an example. Tomato, pepper, as long as they're turning color. Beans would be one that clearly we're waiting until those beans are pretty much dried inside their capsules, on the plant. So it's late in the season and the pods are brittle, dried down, and the seeds have become hard. Seeds, whether they're fairly dry when you extract them or they're wet, they're still going to need further drying, and they're dried down to a pretty low moisture content, 4 to 12%. So it usually takes a week or two after they've been extracted to get them dried down. And we'll talk about those wet, fleshy fruits. I'll use tomato as an example. And then we'll also talk about dry fruits. How do we get the seeds out, and how do we save them? So these are just some examples. We'll talk, I'll show you some photos of threshing and, putting the fruits in a pillowcase and whacking them against a brick wall. There are all kinds of ways you can get the seeds separated out and collected. Okay, and this is just an example of squash seed that was too wet on the left, and so when you hit it with a hammer, it just sort of smushes up. And on the right, we can see we can actually snap that seed, and it's nice and dry and ready to be stored. So that's very important. And just some general, this is all very general. You really need to check the storage requirements for specific crops. And in general, they need to be kept cool and dry and in the dark, preferably. I like glass containers. You can use, coin envelopes. Always put the variety name, the cultivar name, on the storage container and the year that the seeds were collected. So this is the year the crop was grown and the seeds were collected. An old rule of thumb is that temperature and humidity should be less than 100. So when you look at your basement as a place to store, probably it'll be around 100 or maybe higher than that, but basements are a good place to store seeds, I think. And for long-term storage, refrigerators and freezers are fine. The one thing you don't want to do is keep taking seeds out of a freezer and opening them up and checking them out, because you'll get moisture condensation and it can actually reduce their viability. So if you freeze them and take them out, let them come to room temperature, the containers, before you open them up. And the life of a seed really varies a lot by how they're stored and by the particular species, but 2 to 6 years is a pretty good range for vegetables. Okay, and I think this will be a good spot to, oh, right on time, great. So Steph, we can either take questions or break now, or both.
We actually don't have too many questions, so let's just go
Okay.
ahead and do them now.
Okay.
And then we'll maybe take 5 minutes for a break. All right, so the first question, how about peppers the same as tomatoes?
Yeah, they're not. Peppers are actually more likely to outcross, and especially hot chili peppers. There's going to be more cross-pollination. Bees will work the flowers. So the strategy would either be to just plant one cultivar to save seed from, or to actually cage the plants, to actually put a cover over the plants so that bees couldn't move pollen from one cultivar to the cultivar you want to save. For sweet pepper, there's going to be less of an issue, but certainly they are self-pollinating to some degree, but they're also insect pollinated, so you have to take extra care with pepper.
Got it. Thank you. Next question is, should containers be airtight?
Honestly, yes, they should be. So I don't think you need to worry about extracting air from the container. I mean, if you use a plastic bag, you can just smush out the air as you're closing the top of the bag if you're using a Ziploc bag. But I think the old pill bottles are fine. Plastic bottles are fine. Glass is good. So to the extent possible, yes. But again, if you know you're going to be using seeds the next year, the paper envelope is actually fine. You get some degradation, but if you're using the seed the next year, there's no problem there.
Okay. Someone has a food dehydrator and they were thinking of using it for seed saving, but they're afraid of making the seeds too dry. Any thoughts there?
Wow, I don't know. I guess it depends how warm it gets and how long the seeds are in the food dehydrator. I'll bet if you go to the Seed Savers Exchange website, I gotta believe they've addressed that. I don't really know. So I would ask that person to see if they can find out and let us know what they learn. I certainly wouldn't put them in a 170, degree Fahrenheit oven, but a food
Mhm.
dehydrator, if it's at um, 90 degrees, yeah, when you get over though 100, 110, I mean, seeds are put into water baths, hot water baths to kill disease organisms on the outside, and they usually do that up to like 122 degrees. So I would imagine that if the food dehydrator is at like 100 or 110, it's probably going to be okay, but I don't know.
Got it. Okay. To save cucumber seeds, do you use the same technique as tomatoes?
Yes, in terms of extracting the seeds, and I'll show how to extract seeds from squash. Cucumber, you actually need to let it mature quite a bit past eating stage, and then even after that, leave it in the fruit for a while before you take the seeds out. So it's different in that regards, and of course, there's the risk of cross-pollination. It's insect pollinated largely, so you would either need to just grow one cultivar or cover the plants. So more difficult, but certainly not impossible to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you recommend using a desiccant in with the seeds?
Yeah, that you don't need a lot of supplies with seed saving, I don't think. Sometimes, so the anti-desiccant silica gels can come in very handy. So if you're
Mhm.
not sure that the seed's been dried down as dry as it should be, or if there's a concern with the location where the seeds are being stored, having too high humidity, you can very cheaply, purchase silica gels and put some into the containers. They work very well, but I don't think they're essential. But yeah, they can be helpful. Some people just use grains of rice like they would to
Mhm.
keep salt from
Mhm.
drawing moisture.
Sure. All right, last one for now. How long do I need to keep my seeds in an envelope to dry before transferring to a plastic bag?
It depends on the seed. Um, and, just for example, tomato seeds that are they're wet, when you extract them. Well, I'll show some slides of that. I usually leave them out for a couple of weeks inside my house, and then they're completely dried. So I don't think whatever you're saving should take more than a couple of weeks.
Okay, we got
That's
one
my,
more
yeah.
that came in. Do you need to wash the seeds before? Okay, more are coming in. Do you need to wash seeds before you save them or just dry them on a plate, such as tomatoes?
Yeah, it's better to wash them to get whatever's on them off. It'll be easier to dry them, less chance for, a rot organism to be carried in on the seed, something like
Mhm.
that. So yeah, it'd be not dry seeds like bean, but any wet seeds, I would certainly rinse them off well before, spreading them out to dry.
Okay, great. So I think since that is, well, we keep having a couple come in, but we did take 5 minutes of questions. So I think we should do a break for now.
Okay.
So let's just take, is 5 minutes okay, John?
Yeah, yeah, that's great.
All right, so it's 10:51. We'll do 4 minutes. Let's come back at 10:55 to keep
Sounds
going.
good.
Okay, great. See you guys in 4 minutes. We'll be back in 10:55.
Okay, and then I think people are pretty much aware if you're a gardener and you use hybrids that almost always the origin of the seed is outside the US. A lot of seed is produced fairly close to the 45th parallel of latitude. And a lot of seed is coming from China, but other countries as well. And that's mainly because it's quite expensive to produce hybrid seed. The flowers have to be, with tomato, the flowers are emasculated, hand pollinated, and so forth. Okay, there was a question about peppers. Here's the other thing about peppers. So we did mention that they outcross more so than tomatoes, certainly, even though they're in the same family. And the same would be true of eggplant. So with peppers, the other thing that's interesting is it's the only, I'm sure there are other exceptions, but it's the only vegetable family or genus I'm aware of, capsicum genus, where you have interspecies crossing. So with all of our other crops, crossing can occur between cultivars within a species. So that would be intraspecies crossing, but not between species. In the case of peppers, though, we do get crossing between capsicum annuum, which includes jalapeno. It includes serrano, so chili peppers. All of our sweet peppers are in capsicum annuum, and it will cross with these three other species of capsicum: frutescens, chinense, and I'm sorry, those three will cross, right? So those three will cross, and then capsicum bacatum will also cross with these three. The only one that won't cross is, and this is kind of an unusual species, ricotta. I've never grown it. It won't cross with other capsicum. So just be aware of this, that if you grow habanero and then you grow one, Italian frying pepper cultivar, they actually can cross even though they're in different species. And just to make you aware, we get a lot of questions about people insisting that their sweet peppers have been made hot in the current growing season because they were planted next to hot peppers. And that, I've talked to plant breeders about this, and they say that really can't happen. So when a cross occurs, there could be crossing, of course, between cultivars, both within a species and between species of pepper. But where do you see the effect? Well, it's in the maternal tissue. So it's inside that ovule, which will become a seed. And so if we extract the seeds from the crossed plants and plant them next year, then indeed we could have sweet peppers that are pungent, because capsaicin is expressed as on a dominant gene. So it doesn't happen in the season of the cross, though. You don't get that effect of having hot fruits because they were planted, because sweet pepper was planted next to a chili pepper. All right, moving on to summer squash as another scenario. So this is Cucurbita pepo, annual plant, and as we learned, it's monoecious. So we have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. It is self-compatible, which simply means that if we have one summer squash plant, flowers can be pollinated from flowers on that same plant. The pollen doesn't have to come from a separate plant. We can definitely get outcrossing because it is insect pollinated, and we only need one fruit from one plant to have viable seed. So the female flower, of course, has a very clearly seen ovary that is inferior. It's below the flower, and it doesn't look anything like a male flower, right? The male flower is on a straight stem. And some people may think that, if you can see my cursor in this right photo, this is the receptacle with the nectary for the flower. It's not the fruit. This is a male flower, and clearly this is the female flower. You can see the little baby pumpkin on the plant. So whether it's watermelon, muskmelon, any of the crops within this family, you'll see that ovary developing before the flower even opens. Okay, so with squash, we see on the male flower the anther. This is the stamen, and it's actually consists of fused anthers. And so here on the right, we can see the anthers have been gently pulled apart with tweezers, and we can see there are 3 of them that fuse together to form the stamen, or to form the anther cone. And this is the nectary, for the flower. And we can, if we're going to self or hand pollinate our squash or pumpkin, we can simply cut this stem, this pedicel, and use the anther cone as a paintbrush and paint the female flower. Okay, so here's an example of a summer squash. This is Costata romanesco. I wrote a blog post about it Friday for Maryland Grows blog. It's absolutely the best zucchini, in my opinion, that there is. I've been growing it for many years. And if we're going to harvest it for seed, we want it to be quite large. The rind would be getting hard, the fruit stem would be getting dry. And even at that point, the seeds are not mature. So on this fruit, I wrote harvested August 30th. So, I could harvest seeds from this squash in a few more days. And this is what we would typically do. This would be considered wet processing, even though it's certainly not as wet as a tomato. But we'd scoop the seeds out and rinse them, dry them, etc. Now here's the thing. I'm not saving these seeds. And the reason is I only had 2 plants. And I think the recommended minimum, let's see, for summer squash, for variety maintenance, it's 10 to 20 plants. So, or that may be genetic, I'm not sure. I think it's for variety maintenance. So for me to save these seeds, knowing that this plant outcrosses, knowing that I've got 4 neighbors within 300 feet of my garden who also grow squash, there's no way that I'm saving these seeds. I did not protect the plant. It's the only summer squash I grew. So I grew 1 cultivar, but I don't know if some bees carried pollen from another garden to my garden and cross-pollinated this Costata romanesco. I only had 2 plants. So even if I had saved several seeds from those 2 plants, I wouldn't even save the seeds for myself. And I certainly wouldn't save them to share with somebody. Now, let's back up. If I save seeds from maybe just a couple of plants, but I had protected them, if I had greater assurance that there was a very minimal risk of cross-pollination with another cultivar, I would feel okay about saving the seeds. But to further enhance that variety, to make sure that the widest genetic variability is going to be available to me and other gardeners, I would probably mix some seeds from that variety that came from a seed company, because I know they have, ensured to the best of their ability to capture all the traits of that cultivar. So I've done that as well. I've mixed my home saved seeds with seeds from other seed savers and from seed companies. And that just, again, broadens the genetic palette, if you will, of that variety. Okay, we have a poll question, and this is a nice one. Can a zucchini plant, it's Cucurbita pepo, cross with a pumpkin plant also cucurbita pepo. So here are the possible answers.
All right, we'll do the same thing as last time. We'll just go over some of the questions that came in while folks take a chance to answer. Let's see. This is actually a very relative, appropriate question for our poll right now. Do fruits within a family cross, i.e. bitter melon, cucumbers, and watermelon?
Yeah, so those three examples, they would not. They're all in a different species. So they would not cross. Watermelon, bitter melon, and was it cucumber?
Yes.
Yeah, they would not cross with each other
Got it.
because they're separate species.
All right. Cool. So we're up to 75% of folks who have voted again. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll.
Okay, I'm liking it. So D is the, correct answer. Yes, they can cross. They're in the same species. And that may seem a little strange because pumpkins look so different. Acorn squash are in this species. Many pumpkins, the summer squashes, so they'll cross, but you won't see the effects of that cross until you plant seed the next year. So very good, folks. Okay, and I'll move this poll out. Okay, and then finally, we'll just talk a little bit about the bean family. Fabaceae used to be Leguminosae. These are annuals. Mentioned early in the class that they have perfect self-fertile flowers, and they're very self-pollinating. We're going to be collecting seeds when they're dry, so we have to figure out some different techniques for doing that. And they also you can get viable seed from a single pod from a single plant. Okay, but there are differences, right? Common garden beans, Phaseolus vulgaris, is very self-pollinating. Even though I mentioned that, some enterprising bees could cut through the unopened flowers and actually deposit, pollen inside the flower before it's opened. By and large, it's very self-pollinating, and you can save seeds from a relatively small number of plants with relatively small distance between different cultivars, and be assured that you're going to be able to successfully propagate that cultivar, save the seed, and you'll have the same plants the next year. Cowpea, mostly self-pollinating, but there can be some outcrossing from insect pollination. Lima bean, also very much self-pollinated, but even more likely to be visited by different species of bees. And then we've got scarlet runner, which is an incredible plant. I've only grown it a few times, and with climate change, I think it may be harder and harder to grow it in Maryland, but it's not just a beautiful plant with beautiful flowers that attract hummingbirds, but the pods are phenomenal. It's a great eating bean, and it is mostly insect pollinated. So we'd need to be super careful if we were going to try to save seeds from scarlet runner bean. So here's an example. I grow hairy vetch in my garden as a cover crop, and a bunch of the plants end up growing on my fence on one side of my garden. So it's really easy for me midsummer to pull those fruits off and save them. And, all I do is put them in a big bag and let them dry, and I'll press on the bag and push on the bag, and I'll put my hand in there and really agitate those dried fruits to release the seeds. And by doing that, I end up very easily getting a lot of seed to come loose. It's not very difficult. I can further clean this seed because I'm going to put it in a seed broadcaster, a spin seeder. So I will then try to blow the chaff away or put it through a screen. And so um, different types of screening materials can be really useful here to separate the seeds further from the detritus. And here's another example. So on the right photo, but the left side here, this is anise hyssop. The seeds are super, super small. I don't even try to get the seeds out. If they've been in a bag long enough, a lot of them will fall out to the bottom of the bag, especially if I agitate and crush the fruits. I can extract some individual seeds, but it's also easy enough just to plant, I guess I'd call it the fruit parts, which contain the seeds, either in a pot or in the garden. It's the lazy way of doing things, and you may have to do a little thinning, but you can do that. Here's basil, which has larger seed. You can see it on the right here. These little black specks are seeds from basil. And basil is insect pollinated, so it's a plant that if we're going to save seed, we would want to only grow one cultivar and kind of know what the neighbors are doing in terms of their basil growing and check out the recommended isolation distance. But very easy to put basil seed heads, in a pillowcase and whack them against a hard surface to break the seeds out, and they'll fall to the bottom. So a couple of other, here's somebody hand threshing seeds in a container to release the seeds from the fruits. Threshing, this looks like fun. Let's jump on them. So I know people that will run over bags of dried seed fruits with cars or other, heavy things in addition to their feet, but you can thresh by jumping up and down. This is kind of a fun way. So with a lot of dried fruits in a wheelbarrow, you can actually hold a fan or a hair dryer in one hand and, crush and drop the fruits and the airstream will blow the chaff away. I've seen people do that in front of a box fan, just actually drop the seeds into a large bucket below and the air from the box fan blowing the chaff off to one side. And screens are also hardware cloth screens that are a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch can also allow seeds to drop through while keeping the chaff out. So I think that does it for the slides. I see it's 11:24, so I'd be happy to answer some more questions. And I think Jean put a link to an evaluation for today's class. If people would not mind evaluating the class, I would appreciate it. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Steph.
Excellent. All right, so we will continue with the questions that we've had coming into the chat box. So if you have any that you'd like to get answered, feel free to keep sending those in. So our next question is, will the viability of the seeds decrease if they are harvested too early? And will they continue to mature if they're kept in dry, cool conditions?
I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no. That's an interesting question. It's funny because, so if the seeds have not been fully dried and they're stored, I see, stored inside a container, a sealed container. I don't know. I really don't know. I would imagine if they were wet enough, it could set up a rot inside that container if
Mhm.
no air is getting in. If there's enough air, if it's in a paper, I'm sorry, did the person say it was in a paper envelope?
Just that if they were kept in dry, cool conditions, they didn't specify.
Yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
right. As long as they're out and not sealed up, they'll continue to dry. So that would be totally fine. I guess the concern would be putting a seed that's at like 20% moisture in a closed container. It could
Mhm.
cause the seed to rot. But as long as it continued to dry, I think it would be fine. And of course, the way to test it would be once it has fully dried is to, actually do a germination test with that seed.
Yeah, that's good advice. Okay, is a plastic Ziploc bag or plastic container, plastic tote with lid allowed for long-term storage of dry seeds?
It's fine. I guess it depends on how well the seed's dried and what the crop is. If it's a crop that is supposed to stay viable for 5 to 7 years, I don't know that a plastic bag or a plastic tote would really decrease that any, as long as it was kept cool and dry and hopefully dark.
Mm.
I don't think plastic bags or other types of plastic containers are going to significantly reduce seed longevity. But again, that's sort of off the top of my head. Um, I think we could maybe get a more definitive answer, but I don't think it would be a big problem.
Okay. We had a question about fruit flies with fermentation.
Well, it's a pretty quick process, and especially if you're doing it outside, yeah, you may get some fruit flies, but as soon as you bring the seeds back in, rinse them off, that'll take care of the fruit fly problem.
Got it. We have one participant who's been trying to harvest amaranth, and she realizes they're likely cross-pollinated, so it's just for personal use, but looking for suggestions on winnowing such a fine, light seed.
I don't know. I guess it would depend on which amaranth. Trying to think. Uh, I think for beginner or to begin with, making sure the seed heads are dried down, I would maybe hang them upside down in a
Mhm.
paper bag, a large paper bag, maybe even a yard type paper bag, and just keep shaking the dried fruits, agitating and
Mhm.
banging them, see how much seed you could get to land at the bottom of the bag. Probably, yeah, finding a screen size small enough that you could rub the dried fruits through it, so that you could separate the seed. Um, I haven't really tried to save seed from anything in that family, so
Okay.
not sure.
We did get a follow-up on using the food dehydrator. Someone looked up a recommendation on seeds of diversity, and it says if you're using a dehydrator, set it to 85 degrees and check after 6 hours. So there you
Cool.
go.
That
Um,
sounds good.
yeah, we've got one participant that has a basil plant that is flowering. How long before it turns to seed? And if it gets too cold, are the seeds still viable or will they be too immature?
Yeah, if the plant is just now flowering, I'm this is a guess. I'm not sure. I would go online and search for, time between flowering and hard seed for basil. I'm going to guess though that it's 2 to 3 weeks, but then because we're in the fall season now and light and temperature are declining, it would even take longer. So I think it's going to be pretty tough to get hard seed before frost,
Yeah.
but it's possible.
Okay, another basil question. What happens if it self-seeds? Will those seeds grow true? This person has many different varieties of basil in the garden, and some are very prolific when self-seeding, like the holy basil.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Holy basil, especially. I've had it pop up in lots of places, which I actually like. So the basils are all open pollinated, and they will come back. Well, I say they'll come true to seed. There can be crossing. Now, holy basil's in a different species from culinary basil, and so those two won't cross. But if you have say large leaf Italian and Prospera and Genovese,
Mhm.
those can cross because they are in the same basil species. The other thing is, with downy mildew being as bad a problem as it is, I would suggest people grow those downy mildew resistant basil varieties. But none of those will cross with holy basil.
Okay. Um, we have another guest that froze heirloom tomatoes and they're thawing and using a sieve to pull out the seeds before cooking. Can I save those seeds?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Any, as long as the tomato was close to ripe, uh, but yeah, so they haven't been boiled, right? If they've just been removed as part of the process
Yeah, just
for
taking out
saving,
from
yeah,
the
then that's fine, absolutely. Before they go into the freezer or into the sauce pot, yeah, save those seeds.
Mhm. All right. Great. So that's all the questions that we had because we've been going through them throughout the presentation. So that's fantastic. Thank you, John, so much for your time today for presenting. There's lots of great comments about how informative this was and how much everyone learned. So thank you for that. And Jean did put the link into the chat box. So if you guys haven't seen the link for John's evaluation, please be sure to do that before you leave, but we'll probably send up a follow-up email with that link as well.